Your soulmate is trying to reach you right now. It's urgent. Don't ignore this. It doesn't come as a sound. That's what makes it easy to dismiss. No ringing phone, no message preview, no obvious interruption. Instead, it arrives as a pull you feel for no clear reason, a sudden sense that your attention is being asked for right now, not later. You might have brushed it off once already, telling yourself you were imagining things, but the feeling keeps returning in small, persistent ways. This isn't panic. It's pressure without noise. There are moments when urgency doesn't shout because shouting would scare you away. It speaks softly because it needs to be heard, not reacted to. You may notice that your focus has been drifting, that you've reread the same sentence twice, that your mind keeps circling back to a certain person or a certain unfinished thought. That looping isn't random. It's a signal asking you to slow down instead of scroll past it. Right now, something is trying to cross a distance that isn't physical. It's emotional. Energetic. The kind of distance that forms when words go unsaid for too long, when timing keeps missing itself by inches, when two people feel the same shift but don't know how to name it. You might feel a slight restlessness in your body, like you're waiting for something without knowing what. Not anxiety, not excitement, just alertness. Your nervous system recognizes urgency before your logic does. Logic likes proof. The body responds to truth faster. This part of the story isn't about drama. It's about alignment trying to correct itself. You may have noticed that lately, distractions haven't been working the way they used to. Things that normally keep you busy feel flat. Conversations feel thinner. Even silence feels louder. That's because something unresolved has moved to the foreground, and it's asking for acknowledgement. This reach isn't coming from desperation. It's coming from realization. Realization that waiting longer will only deepen the distance. Realization that avoidance no longer protects either of you. Realization that timing doesn't become perfect on its own, it becomes necessary. You might wonder why now. Why not earlier, when things felt easier, lighter, more obvious? The answer is uncomfortable but honest. Earlier, one or both of you weren't ready to hear what this moment requires. Readiness doesn't come from desire alone. It comes from growth, from discomfort, from sitting with things you once avoided. That process takes time. Right now, there's a narrowing of focus happening. Other things are falling away so this can be noticed. Not because it's more important than everything else in your life, but because it's been postponed long enough. You may feel an impulse to check something. A message. A memory. A name you haven't thought about in a while. That impulse isn't coincidence. It's connection seeking a point of contact. This isn't about rushing into conversation. It's about not ignoring the signal entirely. Ignoring it doesn't make it disappear. It just forces it to find louder ways to surface later. You might tell yourself you'll deal with it later, when you have more clarity, more energy, more certainty. But clarity often comes after acknowledgement, not before. Energy returns when you stop resisting what's asking for attention. There's a reason this feels urgent without feeling chaotic. Chaos comes from fear. Urgency here comes from truth wanting to be expressed before it calcifies into regret. You may notice that your thoughts about this person aren't charged the way they once were. They don't spike your emotions. They don't destabilize you. That neutrality isn't indifference. It's readiness. It means you can hear something honestly now without losing yourself. That's important. This reach isn't about pulling you backward. It's about meeting you where you are now. Not who you were then. Not who either of you pretended to be. Who you are after learning, after recalibration, after boundaries. You might feel a subtle resistance rising alongside the pull. A voice that says it's safer not to engage, safer to stay quiet, safer to keep things as they are. That voice learned its job well. It protected you before. But protection can become limitation if it's never questioned. You don't have to act immediately. Urgency doesn't always mean speed. Sometimes it means presence. Being aware instead of dismissive. Open instead of defensive. Right now, what's being asked of you isn't a decision. It's attention. Attention to how your body reacts when you think about responding. Attention to whether your chest tightens or softens. Attention to whether your breath shortens or deepens. Those cues matter more than mental arguments. This moment is also testing something internal. Not your loyalty. Your honesty. Can you admit to yourself that something unfinished still exists without turning it into a fantasy or a fear? Unfinished doesn't mean doomed. It means alive. You may have spent time convincing yourself that silence meant closure. That moving on meant erasing. That strength meant not looking back. But real strength knows the difference between returning and acknowledging. Acknowledging doesn't trap you. It frees you from carrying things unconsciously. This reach is happening because something has shifted on the other side. A realization that silence costs more than vulnerability. That waiting for the perfect moment often means missing the real one. That clarity requires courage, not conditions. You're not being asked to fix anything. You're being asked to listen. Listening doesn't commit you to an outcome. It commits you to honesty. Honesty with yourself first. You might feel an internal debate starting. One part of you says this matters. Another part says don't open old doors. Notice that neither side is wrong. They're protecting different values. The task now isn't to silence one. It's to choose awareness over avoidance. This urgency isn't here to pressure you. It's here to prevent something from being lost to inertia. Inertia is quiet. It feels safe. It tells you nothing needs to change. But inertia is how important things fade without resolution. You don't need to imagine what will happen next. That pulls you out of the moment. Stay with what's happening now. The awareness. The pull. The subtle insistence that this deserves a pause. This is one of those moments that won't repeat itself in the same way. Not because it's dramatic, but because timing like this doesn't loop. It moves forward whether acknowledged or not. You may feel a calm settling underneath everything as you allow yourself to notice this fully. Calm doesn't mean the absence of complexity. It means your system isn't in danger. It can handle truth. That's why this is happening now. You're not the same person you were before. You won't respond the same way. That growth changes the outcome even if the situation looks familiar. This part of the story isn't about romance as intensity. It's about connection as clarity. Clarity asks you to be awake, not reactive. Don't ignore this, not because something bad will happen, but because ignoring it means missing an opportunity to be fully present with something real. Whatever this reach leads to, it will be shaped by how honestly you meet this moment. Pause. Notice. Stay open. That's all that's being asked of you right now. It begins as a disruption, not in your surroundings, but in your rhythm. Something pulls you out of autopilot. You might pause mid-task, stare at nothing for a few seconds, and wonder why your attention suddenly feels claimed. Nothing external demanded it. No alert, no sound. Yet your inner focus has shifted, and once it has, it doesn't easily return to where it was. This part of the story isn't loud, but it is insistent. There are moments when urgency doesn't arrive with fear or chaos. It arrives as clarity pressing gently but firmly against the edges of your awareness. You may feel slightly off-tempo today, like your usual pace no longer fits. That discomfort isn't a warning. It's alignment trying to happen. You may notice that thoughts of a specific person surface unexpectedly, not emotionally charged, not nostalgic, just present. They don't hijack your mood. They don't spiral. They simply appear, as if asking to be acknowledged rather than analyzed. That difference matters. When emotions don't overwhelm, it means you're capable of hearing truth without distortion. This reach isn't about reopening wounds. It's about preventing something unfinished from hardening into something permanent without ever being named. You might sense a hesitation inside yourself. A subtle resistance. The part of you that learned to protect your peace by avoiding anything that could complicate it. That instinct isn't wrong. It kept you safe before. But safety and stagnation can look similar from the inside, and this moment is asking you to tell them apart. There's a reason this feels urgent without feeling frantic. Frantic energy comes from fear. This energy comes from recognition. Recognition that silence has done all it can do. Recognition that time alone doesn't resolve everything. Recognition that clarity requires presence. You may find yourself unusually sensitive to small cues today. A word in a song. A phrase someone says in passing. A memory triggered by something ordinary. These aren't signs meant to predict the future. They're reminders pulling your attention towards something that has reached its limit of being ignored. This part of the story is less about what they want to say and more about whether you're willing to listen without deciding the ending in advance. You might tell yourself you'll deal with it later, when you feel more prepared. But preparation often becomes avoidance when there's no clear finish line. Readiness isn't about knowing what to do. It's about being willing to stay present even when outcomes aren't guaranteed. You may notice that you're not emotionally flooded by this. There's no spike of longing or fear. Instead, there's a grounded curiosity. Curiosity signals that your nervous system isn't threatened. It believes you can engage without losing yourself. That belief didn't exist before. This reach is happening because something shifted on the other side. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but deeply. A realization that distance doesn't always equal protection. That silence can become its own form of loss. That some things need to be acknowledged while there's still space for honesty. You don't need to assume what they'll say. Assumptions pull you out of the present. Stay with what's real right now. The pull. The awareness. The sense that something wants to be addressed rather than buried. There's also something important about the timing. This isn't happening on a day filled with chaos. It's happening when you're capable of pausing. When your internal world has enough stability to hold complexity without collapsing into it. That timing isn't accidental. You may feel a quiet internal debate unfolding. One voice says engaging could complicate things. Another says ignoring it will leave something unresolved. Neither voice is wrong. They're weighing different costs. The task now isn't to silence one, but to choose awareness over avoidance. Awareness doesn't commit you to action. It commits you to honesty. This moment isn't asking you to fix anything. It's asking you to acknowledge that something meaningful is trying to reach you before it fades into inertia. Inertia is comfortable. It tells you nothing needs to change. But inertia is how important things drift into permanent distance. You might notice that your emotional responses feel slower than before. Not blunted, just measured. That slowness gives you room to respond instead of react. It gives you choice. Choice is what was missing in earlier versions of this story. You may also notice that your sense of self feels intact. You're not afraid of losing ground by engaging. You know where your boundaries are. You trust yourself to step back if something doesn't feel right. That trust changes everything. This reach isn't pulling you backward into who you were. It's meeting you as who you are now. That distinction is crucial. Past versions of you may not have been ready for this conversation. Present-day you is. You might feel a moment of emotional honesty surface. An admission to yourself that something unresolved still exists. That admission doesn't weaken you. It clears internal space. Denial takes energy. Honesty releases it. You don't need to romanticize this. Romance clouds perception. You don't need to catastrophize it either. Fear does the same. Let this be what it is. An attempt at connection seeking acknowledgement. You may feel an impulse to reach out, or an impulse to wait. Notice both without judging. Urgency here doesn't mean immediate action. It means not pretending this isn't happening. Attention is the first response. Right now, what's being asked of you isn't courage in the form of bold action. It's courage in the form of presence. Staying with the discomfort of not knowing while refusing to numb it away. That kind of courage is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. But it changes outcomes. This moment won't last forever. Moments like this either deepen into conversation or fade into regret. Not because of fate, but because of response. You don't need to imagine what happens next. That pulls you out of the now. Stay here. With the awareness. With the pull. With the sense that something meaningful deserves your attention. Whatever this leads to will be shaped less by what's said and more by how honestly you meet this moment. You're not being asked to rush. You're not being asked to retreat. You're being asked to notice. Notice what you feel without judgment. Notice what you resist without shame. Notice what's asking to be acknowledged before it goes quiet again. That's all this moment requires. And that, in itself, is enough to change the direction of the story. You don't wake up thinking about it. That's what makes it strange. The awareness arrives later, slipping into your day while you're already moving, already doing, already focused on something else. It catches you off guard because it doesn't demand attention. It simply places itself there, quietly, until you realize it hasn't left. This part of the story begins after the urgency has been acknowledged but not yet acted on. It's the space where awareness lingers without instruction. You're not being pushed. You're not being chased. You're being accompanied by a sense that something meaningful is present, waiting for you to recognize it fully. There's a difference between feeling pressured and feeling called. Pressure tightens the body. A call steadies it. What you're experiencing now is steadiness mixed with alertness. Your system isn't bracing for impact. It's listening. You might notice that your mind isn't racing ahead to conclusions the way it once did. You're not scripting conversations or rehearsing emotional outcomes. Those habits belong to a time when uncertainty felt dangerous. Now, uncertainty feels informative. It tells you where attention is needed without telling you what to decide. This stage isn't about response. It's about recognition. Throughout the day, you may find yourself pausing more often. Not in confusion, but in awareness. Moments stretch slightly longer. Silence feels fuller. Even ordinary tasks carry a different weight, as if something underneath them is being gently emphasized. That emphasis isn't dramatic. It's subtle. And subtlety is harder to ignore once you notice it. You may realize that you're no longer asking whether this matters. You already know it does. The question now is how it matters, and that answer isn't available through thinking alone. It will reveal itself through presence. There was a time when emotional significance felt overwhelming. When it demanded action, explanation, or escape. Now, significance feels contained. Manageable. You're capable of holding it without rushing to resolve it. That capacity didn't appear by accident. It was built through experiences where you had to sit with discomfort without being consumed by it. Through moments when you learned that not everything needs immediate answers to be valid. This reach isn't trying to destabilize your life. It's trying to be integrated into it honestly. You might notice that your emotional reactions feel slower, but deeper. Instead of spikes, there's depth. Instead of urgency-driven thoughts, there's reflective awareness. This shift allows you to observe rather than react. Observation gives you choice. You may also become aware of how little you need external confirmation right now. You're not checking for signs to validate your experience. You're trusting your internal cues. That trust is new, and it's changing how you relate to moments like this. This part of the story doesn't ask you to interpret everything. Interpretation can come later. Right now, the task is simply to stay with what's present without minimizing it or inflating it. You might feel a quiet emotional honesty surface. An admission that something unfinished still exists, not as longing, not as regret, but as truth. Truth doesn't always carry emotion. Sometimes it carries clarity. Clarity doesn't demand action. It invites consideration. There's also something important about what isn't happening. You're not feeling pulled into old emotional patterns. You're not losing sleep. You're not spiraling. That absence tells you something. It tells you that whatever this is, you're equipped to handle it now. Earlier versions of you might have mistaken this reach for chaos. Today, it feels like information. Information allows discernment. You may notice that your sense of time feels different. You're not watching the clock. You're not waiting for a moment to pass or arrive. You're existing within it. That presence reduces anxiety before it can form. This is what emotional regulation looks like when it's genuine, not forced. You might also sense a subtle boundary inside yourself. Not a wall, but a line. A clear understanding of what you're willing to engage with and what you're not. That boundary isn't rigid. It's responsive. Responsive boundaries protect connection instead of blocking it. This reach is happening because something has shifted in the relational space between you and this person. Not because everything has changed, but because enough has. Enough understanding. Enough growth. Enough distance from old patterns. Distance doesn't always weaken connection. Sometimes it clarifies it. You may find yourself less interested in why this is happening and more interested in how it feels to be present with it. That shift matters. Why pulls you into analysis. How keeps you grounded. Grounding allows honesty without fear. There's also a quiet relief you might feel, though you can't quite name it. Relief that something unspoken is no longer entirely silent. Relief that awareness has replaced avoidance. Relief that you're not pretending indifference where interest still exists. Pretending costs energy. Honesty returns it. You don't need to romanticize this moment to honor it. Romance distorts perception. You also don't need to downplay it to stay safe. Minimization does the same. Let this moment exist at its true size. True size is often smaller than fantasy but larger than dismissal. You may notice that your thoughts about the other person feel clearer now. Less idealized. Less guarded. You're seeing them as someone capable of reaching out, not as a symbol of past emotion. Seeing someone clearly is different from seeing them intensely. This part of the story isn't asking you to open every door. It's asking you to notice which ones are no longer locked from fear, but from choice. Choice is empowering. You might feel moments of stillness where nothing seems to happen, and yet those moments feel full. Full of awareness. Full of possibility. Full of self-connection. That fullness doesn't need action to be meaningful. This is where many people get uncomfortable. Stillness without instruction can feel unsettling. But you're tolerating it. Even appreciating it. That tells you how far you've come. You're no longer dependent on momentum to feel secure. You may also notice that you're less interested in controlling outcomes. Control once felt like safety. Now it feels limiting. You trust your ability to respond more than your ability to predict. That trust changes the tone of everything. This reach doesn't require you to decide today. It requires you to remain available to truth when it presents itself. Availability doesn't mean agreement. It means openness. Open without being unguarded. Aware without being anxious. Present without being consumed. That balance is rare, and you're living it. As this day moves forward, you may notice that the urgency softens but doesn't disappear. It transforms. It becomes steadiness. A quiet knowing that something meaningful has been acknowledged, even if nothing has been said yet. Acknowledgement is the first shift. You're not being asked to rush toward resolution. Resolution forced too early often creates confusion. Let this moment breathe. Let it settle. Let it reveal itself gradually. Gradual doesn't mean stagnant. It means integrated. You may feel a sense of respect for yourself emerging. Respect for not ignoring what mattered. Respect for not overreacting. Respect for staying with complexity without needing to simplify it. That self-respect is the foundation of any honest connection. This part of the story doesn't end with action. It ends with readiness. Readiness to respond when the time comes. Readiness to stay grounded regardless of outcome. Readiness to honor yourself without closing off to possibility. Readiness doesn't make noise. It doesn't rush. It doesn't demand proof. It simply exists. And as this moment settles into you, not as a question but as awareness, you'll realize something important. You didn't need certainty to stay present. You didn't need guarantees to stay open. You needed trust in yourself. That trust is already here. And quietly, without forcing anything forward, it has changed the direction of the story. It enters through a pause you didn't plan. A moment where your hands slow down, your eyes stop scanning, and something inside you says, "Stay here for a second." Not because something is wrong, but because something is finally clear enough to be felt. This pause doesn't feel heavy. It feels deliberate, like your inner world has decided this moment deserves your full attention. This part of the story isn't about urgency anymore. It's about gravity. The kind that doesn't pull you off balance, but pulls you into yourself. You're not being rushed toward a response. You're being anchored into awareness. You may notice that you're less reactive now than you were even a short time ago. Situations that once would have stirred emotion now pass through you with less resistance. That doesn't mean you've become detached. It means you've become discerning. There's a difference, and you feel it clearly now. Discerning energy doesn't ask, "What do I do next?" It asks, "What is actually happening right now?" As this awareness settles, you might sense a quiet confidence forming. Not the kind that needs reinforcement or reassurance, but the kind that comes from familiarity with yourself. You recognize your emotional landscape. You know where your limits are. You know what you can hold without breaking. That knowledge changes how you experience connection. There was a time when being reached for would have felt destabilizing. It would have disrupted your inner balance, pulled you into speculation, stirred hope or fear too quickly. Now, the reach lands differently. It doesn't knock you over. It meets you where you stand. You're not interpreting it as a demand. You're not interpreting it as a promise. You're interpreting it as information. Information is neutral until you engage with it. You might notice that you're no longer trying to fill silence with meaning. Silence feels complete on its own. That's not emptiness. That's containment. It means you're not afraid of what hasn't been said yet. Fear used to rush you. Calm lets things arrive. This stage of the journey is marked by restraint, but not suppression. You're allowing feelings to exist without amplifying them. You're letting thoughts pass without attaching to them. That restraint isn't avoidance. It's trust in timing. Timing matters more than intensity ever could. You may find yourself reflecting on how often you used to confuse emotional activation with truth. How you believed that if something felt intense, it must be meaningful. Now you see that intensity often comes from imbalance. Meaning comes from steadiness. Steadiness doesn't shout. It doesn't chase. It waits without tension. You're experiencing that now. As the day unfolds, you may become aware of how present you feel in your own life. You're not mentally elsewhere. You're not rehearsing conversations or replaying memories. You're here. Fully. That presence creates a sense of fullness that doesn't depend on outcome. This part of the story isn't asking you to resolve anything. It's asking you to recognize how far you've come in your ability to stay grounded when something matters. You might notice that your emotional boundaries feel firm but flexible. You can engage without overextending. You can listen without absorbing. That balance protects you from old patterns without cutting you off from connection. Old versions of you may have believed boundaries were walls. You now know they're filters. They let in what aligns and keep out what doesn't, without drama. This reach you're sensing isn't trying to breach your boundaries. It's respecting them. That alone tells you something important. You may also notice that you're no longer invested in controlling the narrative. You don't need this to go a certain way to feel okay. That release of control frees up emotional space. Control once felt like safety because you didn't trust outcomes. Now, safety comes from trusting yourself regardless of outcome. That's a profound shift. This part of the journey invites you to notice subtle emotional cues rather than obvious signals. A sense of ease. A lack of tension. A calm curiosity. These cues are easy to miss if you're looking for fireworks. But you're not looking for fireworks anymore. You might also feel a quiet compassion for the version of yourself who would have struggled with this moment. Who would have overthought it? Who would have either rushed in or shut down? That compassion isn't pity. It's appreciation. Appreciation for growth that didn't happen overnight. As you sit with this awareness, you may feel something settle deep in your chest. Not excitement. Not relief. Alignment. Alignment between how you feel and how you're responding. Alignment feels natural. It doesn't need explanation. You're not asking yourself whether you should respond right now. You're asking yourself whether you're present enough to respond honestly when the time comes. That's a better question. This stage isn't about action. It's about readiness that doesn't pressure itself. You may notice that the urgency you felt earlier has softened into clarity. Clarity doesn't push. It illuminates. It shows you what's there without telling you what to do with it. Clarity trusts your judgment. There's also a subtle emotional independence present now. You're not leaning on this moment to provide meaning or direction. Your life doesn't hinge on it. That independence doesn't diminish connection. It strengthens it. Connection rooted in independence is stable. Connection rooted in need is volatile. You know the difference now. This part of the story doesn't end with a decision, a message, or a revelation. It ends with self-awareness. Awareness of how you respond when something important surfaces. Awareness of how you stay connected to yourself under pressure. That awareness will guide you more than any advice ever could. You're not missing anything by not rushing. You're not losing anything by staying present. You're not delaying your life by honoring your pace. You're living it consciously. As this moment integrates, you may notice that you feel lighter without feeling detached. Engaged without being consumed. Open without being exposed. That balance is rare, and it's earned. This part doesn't close with finality. It closes with steadiness. With the quiet confidence that you can meet whatever comes next without abandoning yourself. And that, without drama or declaration, is what real readiness looks like. It shows up as a shift in how you carry the day, like the weight you didn't know you were holding has been redistributed instead of dropped. You're not lighter because something ended or began. You're lighter because something inside you settled into its proper place. That difference matters more than it sounds. This part of the story isn't about what's happening between you and another person anymore. It's about what's happening within you as a result of staying present instead of escaping. Presence has consequences. Quiet ones. Long-lasting ones. You may notice that your thoughts have slowed into something more deliberate. Not heavy. Not dull. Just intentional. You're no longer scanning the situation for hidden meaning. You're allowing meaning to form naturally, without force. That patience is new, and it's reshaping how you experience emotional moments. There was a time when emotional significance felt urgent, like it demanded immediate interpretation. Now, significance feels patient. It doesn't need to be explained to be real. It simply exists, waiting for you to be ready to understand it fully. You might catch yourself moving through the day with a steadier pace. Your body isn't bracing. Your mind isn't jumping ahead. You're not preparing defenses or rehearsing responses. You're inhabiting your own life instead of hovering above it. That grounded presence didn't come from certainty. It came from acceptance. Acceptance that not everything needs to be solved to be held honestly. This stage is marked by emotional spaciousness. You have room now. Room to feel without being overwhelmed. Room to consider without being consumed. Room to stay open without dissolving into old patterns. You might notice that when thoughts about the other person arise, they don't pull you out of yourself. They pass through with less charge. That doesn't mean they don't matter. It means you're no longer attaching your sense of stability to them. Stability rooted in self-trust changes how everything feels. You may also realize that you're no longer asking yourself what this situation says about you. That question used to linger beneath everything. Now it feels irrelevant. You know who you are regardless of how this unfolds. Knowing that creates freedom. This part of the journey isn't about anticipation. It's about integration. Integration is when experiences become information instead of emotional residue. Instead of replaying, you absorb. Instead of ruminating, you reflect. Reflection doesn't trap you in the past. It contextualizes it. You might notice moments where silence feels comfortable rather than awkward. Silence used to invite anxiety. Now it invites clarity. You're not rushing to fill it because you're not afraid of what might surface. That comfort with silence is a sign of internal safety. You may feel a subtle shift in how you relate to uncertainty. Uncertainty no longer feels like a threat. It feels like space. Space where outcomes aren't fixed, and therefore not limiting. That shift allows curiosity to replace fear. Curiosity asks different questions. Not, what if this goes wrong, but what does this show me about where I am now? Those questions lead inward, not outward. You might also notice that you're less interested in explaining yourself. You don't feel the need to justify your pace, your boundaries, or your responses. That ease comes from self-validation. You're no longer outsourcing your sense of rightness. Self-validation quiets a lot of internal noise. This part of the story isn't dramatic, but it's meaningful. It's the kind of meaning that doesn't demand attention but changes behavior over time. You'll notice it later, in how you respond to situations that once unsettled you. You may reflect on how often you used to confuse emotional intensity with depth. Now you recognize that depth often shows up as steadiness, as consistency, as the ability to remain present without needing emotional highs or lows to feel alive. That recognition reshapes your expectations. You might also become aware of a growing respect for your own emotional process. You're not rushing it. You're not judging it. You're letting it unfold at its own pace. That respect is something you didn't always give yourself. Respect creates trust. Trust allows openness without fear. As this awareness continues to integrate, you may feel less pressure to define the relationship or situation. Definitions can come later. Right now, you're more interested in how it feels to stay connected to yourself while engaging with complexity. That skill will serve you beyond this moment. You may notice that your emotional energy feels conserved rather than depleted. You're not spending it managing anxiety or suppressing feelings. That conservation leaves you with more capacity for your life as a whole. Capacity expands when you stop fighting yourself. This stage isn't asking you to decide anything. It's asking you to notice how differently you inhabit uncertainty now. You're not frozen by it. You're not propelled by it. You're coexisting with it. Coexistence is maturity. You might feel a quiet satisfaction in that realization. Not pride, exactly, but recognition. Recognition that you've grown in ways that don't announce themselves. Growth like this is subtle. It doesn't seek applause. It shows up in moments where you remain calm when you once would have panicked. You may also sense that your emotional boundaries feel more natural now. You're not enforcing them aggressively. You're living them. They exist without explanation. That naturalness reduces friction. This part of the story doesn't push toward resolution. It allows space for truth to emerge organically. Truth that's rushed often becomes distorted. Truth that's allowed to surface on its own tends to be cleaner. You're giving truth that space. You might notice that you're less invested in controlling how this experience fits into your larger narrative. You're not forcing it to mean something specific. You're letting it be one chapter among many. That perspective prevents over-attachment. Over-attachment once made things feel heavier than they needed to be. Now, you're carrying experiences without letting them carry you. This stage also invites you to recognize how your relationship with yourself has shifted. You're less critical. Less demanding. More observant. That gentleness creates resilience. Resilience doesn't come from hardness. It comes from flexibility. You may feel moments of quiet clarity where things make sense without explanation. Those moments don't last forever, but they leave a residue of calm. Calm is information too. As this part of the journey settles, you may realize that you're no longer waiting for a signal to move forward or backward. You're comfortable standing where you are until movement feels natural. Natural movement doesn't require force. You're not ignoring what matters. You're honoring it by not rushing it. That distinction is important. This part of the story doesn't conclude with a statement or a turning point. It concludes with equilibrium. With the understanding that you can remain open, grounded, and self-aware even when outcomes are uncertain. That equilibrium will shape how you respond when the next moment arrives. You're not missing out by staying here. You're building something internal that doesn't depend on timing or response. And that internal steadiness will quietly influence every choice you make going forward, without needing to announce itself or prove its worth. That's where this part rests. It starts with a sense of quiet ownership over your own time, like realizing you no longer need to rush through moments to feel safe inside them. You wake up, move, breathe, and notice that nothing inside you is pulling forward or dragging backward. There's a steadiness that wasn't there before, and it doesn't come from answers. It comes from self-possession. This part of the story lives in that space. You may notice that your days feel fuller even though nothing externally has changed. The same routines, the same surroundings, the same responsibilities. But internally, you're no longer fragmented. Your attention isn't split between what's happening and what might happen. You're here. Fully. That alone changes the texture of your experience. Earlier, moments like this would have made you restless. You would have interpreted stillness as stagnation. Now, stillness feels like strength. It's not empty. It's contained. It holds everything without forcing anything. You're beginning to understand that emotional momentum doesn't always mean progress. Sometimes progress looks like restraint. Like choosing not to act from impulse. Like allowing clarity to arrive instead of chasing it. This stage isn't about restraint born of fear. It's restraint born of trust. You may notice that you're less preoccupied with how things are perceived. You're not crafting internal narratives about how you should feel or what this should become. That pressure has eased. You're letting the experience exist without demanding it justify itself. That's a sign of emotional maturity most people don't recognize until they live it. You might find yourself engaging more deeply with your own life again. Tasks feel less like distractions and more like anchors. Conversations feel more grounded. You're not half present anymore. Your attention isn't constantly pulled elsewhere. Presence has a way of restoring dignity to ordinary moments. This part of the journey isn't defined by interaction. It's defined by integration. Integration is when what you experience doesn't disrupt you, but informs you. Instead of asking, "What does this mean?" you ask, "What does this reveal?" Revelation doesn't need urgency. It needs honesty. You may notice that your emotional reactions continue to soften without becoming distant. Softness doesn't mean vulnerability without boundaries. It means openness with awareness. You're allowing yourself to feel without letting feelings dictate your actions. That balance didn't exist before. You might also recognize how much less you're explaining things to yourself. Internal justification used to take up a lot of space. Now, silence fills that space comfortably. You're no longer arguing with your own instincts. Trusting yourself reduces internal noise. This part of the story doesn't involve anticipation. You're not waiting for a message, a sign, or a resolution. You're waiting only in the sense that you're available, not suspended. Availability without suspension is freedom. Freedom looks calm, not dramatic. You may notice that thoughts about the other person arise with neutrality. Not coldness. Not attachment. Just clarity. They don't intrude. They don't linger. They inform and pass. That neutrality is earned. It comes from knowing you can engage without losing yourself, and disengage without guilt. That knowledge creates emotional flexibility. You're no longer measuring connection by intensity. You're measuring it by coherence. Does it fit within your life without distortion? Does it align without demanding sacrifice of self? Alignment doesn't rush. This stage allows you to recognize how often you once overextended emotionally. How you confused effort with care. How you believed showing up meant giving more than you had. That pattern doesn't appeal to you anymore. Not because you care less, but because you care more accurately. You may feel a growing respect for your emotional energy. You're not guarding it out of fear. You're stewarding it out of understanding. Energy is finite. You're choosing where it flows. That choice feels natural now. This part of the journey doesn't ask you to define what comes next. It asks you to honor where you are. Honor looks like patience without passivity. Like openness without obligation. You may notice that uncertainty doesn't feel threatening anymore. It feels spacious. A place where possibilities exist without pressure. That spaciousness allows truth to emerge organically. Truth forced too early becomes brittle. Truth allowed to emerge becomes stable. You're choosing stability. You might also become aware of how differently you handle internal conflict now. When doubts arise, you don't suppress them or amplify them. You observe. Observation creates distance without denial. Distance allows discernment. Discernment helps you recognize which thoughts are protective reflexes and which are intuitive signals. That distinction wasn't always clear to you. Now it is. This stage of the story isn't dramatic, but it's foundational. It's where self-trust solidifies. Self-trust doesn't announce itself. It shows up in how calmly you navigate ambiguity. You may notice that you're less invested in controlling outcomes and more invested in maintaining integrity. Integrity means responding in ways that align with your values, regardless of how things unfold. Integrity creates peace that outcomes can't provide. This part also reveals something important about your capacity for connection. You're no longer afraid of depth, but you're also no longer impressed by it alone. Depth without stability no longer feels appealing. You want connection that can coexist with your life, not consume it. That clarity refines desire. You might feel moments of contentment arise unexpectedly. Not because everything is settled, but because nothing inside you feels at odds. Internal coherence creates contentment even in uncertainty. That coherence is something you built, not something you were given. This stage doesn't involve declarations or conclusions. It involves embodiment. You're living what you've learned instead of thinking about it. Living it changes everything. You may notice that your emotional reactions feel proportionate now. Nothing feels exaggerated. Nothing feels minimized. Experiences land at their true weight. True weight is manageable. You're no longer rehearsing future scenarios. Rehearsal once felt like preparation. Now it feels unnecessary. You trust your ability to respond authentically when the moment arrives. Authenticity doesn't need scripts. This part of the story rests in that trust. Trust that you'll know what to do when you need to. Trust that you don't need to anticipate everything to be prepared. Preparedness rooted in self-awareness is resilient. You may also sense a subtle shift in how you view time. You're less concerned with when things happen. You're more concerned with how they feel when they do. Quality over timing. This stage ends without fanfare. It doesn't need an ending that announces itself. It settles quietly, like something placed exactly where it belongs. You're not waiting. You're not chasing. You're not closing doors. You're standing in alignment with yourself. And that alignment doesn't fade when moments pass. It carries forward, shaping how you meet whatever comes next, without needing to be named or proved. That's where this part completes itself.
It resolves quietly, not because everything has been said or decided, but because something inside you has come back into balance. But because something inside come back balance, there is no dramatic conclusion, no final realization that ties everything up neatly. Instead, there's a calm certainty that whatever this experience was meant to teach you, it has already done its work. You may notice that you are no longer replying moment or scanning your thought for unfinished threads. The questions that once lingered don't feel urgent anymore. Not because answers appear, but because you stop needing them to feel steady. The steadiness is the real ending. This journey wasn't about receiving a message, a confession, or a clear direction. It was about learning how you respond when something meaningful tries to reach you. It showed you that you can stay open without losing yourself, attentive, without becoming consumed, honest without being exposed. That matters more than any outcome. You are carrying this forward now and not as a memory you cling to, but as a quiet shift in how you live, how you'll notice it later, in moments that seem unrelated. In now you pause before reacting, in now you trust yourself instinct without second guessing them, in how you allow things to unfold without forcing clarity too soon. Nothing about to feel unfinished here. You didn't miss your chance by not rushing. You didn't fail by deciding everything immediately. You honored yourself by staying present, and presence is never wasted. It always leaves something intact. If there was urgency at the beginning, it has transformed into understanding. You are no longer waiting for a sign. You have become attentive enough to notice when something truly matters and confident enough to let it breathe. This ending doesn't close the door or open it dramatically. It leaves you standing comfortably where you are. Take a moment to sit with that. If this story resonated with you, with felt that real, not rushed, not forced, let it settle. And if you are want more moment like this, story done just intent but grounded, stay connected here. Like, subscribe, or leave a comment if you felt something shift while reading. Not because you have to, but because shared awareness has a way of deepening understanding. You are not ending anything here. You are continuing forward, steadier than before, carrying clarity instead of question, and that's enough. So, I thank you. The story ends here.